here for this event, which is on the future of humanitarian design. And the idea with the event is to discuss possible ways of moving away from the problematic side of humanitarian design that we have heard a lot about in critical research, and specifically away from the techno-fetishism and the commercial capture, and the move towards something like a post-humanitarian order, no longer people, just material technologies and SMS humanitarianism. And we're doing this in the context of a project that we're starting. And this is actually, I think, the first public debate we have about that project, which is entitled The Future of Humanitarian Design. And it's a 4-year Synergia project with a bunch of partners, and some of them in this room, many on the panel. So academically, it combines people from engineering, from the EPFL Essential Tech Lab, and people from HED. And sorry, maybe I should have pointed to Grégoire, who sits in the room from the Essential Tech Lab, and we just employed a senior researcher for this. We're in the process. From HED, where we have Javier with us on the panel, who's an architect, and we also have Damien in the room, who's also an architect from HED. And then it's political scientists like and international relations scholars like Jonathan Austin and myself. I'm going to introduce this properly in just a second. And then we have professional partners that we're working with. And for this first public event, we've invited people from the ICRC to join us, but we're also working with people in the context where we will be doing fieldwork. So in the kibbutz in the DRC, and in Colombia, probably the Darien Gap, TBD. Okay, so let me just say a little bit about what we're going to do now to discuss the possible futures of humanitarian design. We're going to have each of us introduce, and let me just introduce the panelists so you know who's here. So at the far end is Jonathan Austin, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Copenhagen, and also Director of the Center for Advanced Security Theory. So it's super to have you here, and he's played a very important role in developing this research project. It's Gilles Carbonnier, who's Vice President of the ICRC, and also one of my colleagues here, a Professor of Development Economics, and I think a brilliant example of people actually moving between professional roles of different kinds, including the academic and the practical. So thanks a lot, Gilles, for taking time. Obviously, Gilles is very busy these days. It's Javier Fernandez Contreras, who is head of the Department of Interior Architecture at the School of Art and Design. And it's a huge pleasure to work with him. He's done a lot of interesting theoretical work, which really helps the conversation. So thanks for being here. And it's Pascal Hufschmidt, who's the director of the Museum of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Am I saying this right now? The ICRC Museum up the road that everyone who hasn't visited should go and visit. And Pascal has a background as an art historian with a specialization in photography. And it's a huge pleasure to learn about how to think museums and exhibitions from Pascal, and how to think about how one can actually work with this in that kind of a context. So what's going to happen now is the panelists will make a short introductory statement so that we have something to talk about 7 minutes each or something like that. And then we'll have a little short discussion on the panel with reactions to each other, and then we'll open it up for public discussion. So we're actually going, I think, in this order. So please, Jonathan, the word is yours.
Thank you. Does this work? Yes. Okay, thanks so much for everyone for being here and for organizing, Camilla, and everybody involved. So I'm going to open with the title of the question of the event today in very broad terms. So, what's the future of humanitarian design? And to explore this question, I want to go back in time a little bit. Bear with me. In 1963, Che Guevara addressed the first international meeting of architecture students in Havana. And at the end of his speech, he said very simply that never forget that technology is a weapon. If you feel the world is not as perfect as it should be, then you must struggle to put the weapon of technology at the service of society. Technology is a weapon. At a basic level, we see this everywhere. Emergent technologies are folded with exceptional speed into and beyond the military-industrial complex. Drones, quantum computing, social media, digital fabrication, etc., etc., etc. The weaponization of technology is a permanent part of history. But can this weapon of technology serve humanitarian purposes? Can it serve liberation, emancipation, justice, freedom? Whatever you think of the Cuban political project, it's one of the few movements to have articulated and put into direct action, perhaps too radically, that sentiment. Nonetheless, and albeit to a less radical degree, this is also one of the core ethical impulses of what's become known as humanitarian design. But has humanitarian design become a weapon for liberation, justice, freedom, whatever you want to call it? For critics, the answer is quite clearly no. Humanitarian design is often accused of being apolitical, of being impotent to put the weapon of technology at the service of society. And while this critique is directed often at humanitarianism more broadly, the focus of much humanitarian design on the technological is seen as cementing these issues through a kind of naive belief in the power of technology. For some, it seems to provide an intensely materialized, concretized, static, immovable version of the humanitarian alibi that James Orbinski, former president of NSF, described as working to mask the state's responsibility to ensure justice and security. The future of humanitarian design for me then rests on seeking to imagine a more radical humanitarian role for technology, something closer to the Cuban dream for its place in the world. So the future of humanitarian design for me rests on what I want to articulate as a more militant form of humanitarian design. What does that mean? I'll try and unpack this by staying with the analogy of weapons. The drone, the military drone, is the most recent manifestation of the weaponization of technology, perhaps. But paradoxically, as we all know, the drone is also described as both the ultimate mode of annihilating human bodies from the sky and for being the most ethical weapon ever known to humankind. For military organizations, the drone surveils from the sky, surveils its enemies from above, but also civilian populations, whom it insists are spared violence thanks to the sophistication of the drone's technology. The French philosopher Grégoire Chamayou described this convergence in terms of a humanitarian logic, human militarism, humanitarianism, the meshing of humanitarian and military principles. This is a very perverse logic, but it also contains, I want to suggest in these broad opening remarks, a kernel of truth that humanitarian design can learn from. Why? Because when humanitarians themselves deploy drones, in most circumstances, to deliver, let's say, aid to distant communities and so, wherever we're talking about, the gaze of those humanitarian drones is, for the most part, limited very specifically to those who are suffering. The principal contemporary failure of humanitarian design, I want to say, is not its good intentions, is not its ethical logics, but the limit to its gaze, a continued allegiance to understanding humanitarian action as being characterized by the imperative of taking care of humans in distress, in this exceptionally minimalist understanding of the targets of humanitarian design. Unlike military deployments of drones, humanitarian drones And much humanitarian design, though not all, as I'll come back to, has yet to develop a full spectrum logic, to follow again the military terminology, that deploys the material, the technological, the architectural, and other design forms to intervene against those organizations that cause humanitarian suffering itself, to use them as weapons. A kind of militant humanitarian design, then, would involve a similar expansion of the gaze of the technological. What would this look like? What would a humanitarian drone that observed the activities of military organizations look like? What would an algorithm designed to change the behavior of security forces look like? What can humanitarian design do if it expands its gaze? At this stage, it's hard to say, but we can find inspiration again by going back in time. The design of international humanitarian law is very analogous to what I'm advocating for here. International humanitarian law targets both those who are in distress and those who cause distress or could prevent distress. Humanitarian actors, sometimes seen as conservative, take the ICRC, are in fact radically engaged not only with those who suffer, but also engaging those who cause suffering or could prevent suffering. They work to translate into international humanitarian law into practice by, as we've seen recently, the ICRC negotiating for the release of hostages in Gaza, and assessing detention conditions from the inside, as well as for very concrete material interventions to redesign prison spaces and detention facilities that I think you will speak to in a moment. In this, the problem of humanitarianism and humanitarian design is articulated as both, of course, about the crucial task of alleviating suffering in the here and now, but also a slow, very slow, yet certain reckoning with the structures that cause humanitarian suffering. Humanitarian design in its contemporary manifestations, I want to suggest, must seek the same, or rather to expand the ways in which it does this. If the most alarming of killer drones that exist today achieve their tasks through a certain pattern of life analysis that seeks to quantitatively analyze the dynamics of populations under surveillance, a militant humanitarian design would be equally concerned with such patterns of life, but invert that gaze and seek to understand and intervene against patterns of life that cause harm, to design technologies that constrain the patterns of life that cause harm. This is not a utopian logic. A militant design is intended to be critical, but also to be extremely pragmatic. It would involve the design and development of technologies that only very marginally shift, potentially, the behavior of those who wield power, but which over time, just as we've seen with the logic of humanitarianism at a broader level, can have very significant effects on humanitarian settings. So this is one of the provocations of this project then. To return to the quote which I started from Che Guevara, if technology is a weapon, then the question is what that weapon is designed to do, and more importantly, for whom. A militant humanitarian design would contribute to never forgetting that technology can be a weapon for designing futures in which humanitarian crises are less prevalent and work preemptively, not reactively, to reduce global suffering. But I'll end it.
Thanks. I don't know, should we applaud? Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Gilles, please.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Anna, for this invitation and to follow suit on what Jonathan has raised on this very interesting, I think, timely research project, because there is no doubt that any built environment influences the way we feel and we act within a given context. And it also influences the way we see and we perceive those who are embodied, the institution embodied by a built environment, by a building. And I recall something very anecdotal, but with regard to the Graduate Institute, we were scattered in 4 or 5 different locations across the town, and each of them having its own identity and kind of flavor. And when we opened the Maison de la Paix, it gave quite a different tone in terms of identity, both of course for students, for faculty members, and the dynamics it spurs. So it's really influences way beyond what we can think in terms of projection. And to apply this to, I think, 3 basic humanitarian built environment that you consider in the research project is very interesting. We have, of course, the humanitarian compound, and how within that compound humanitarians relate to host communities, to people around, how it is perceived by these communities. We have the emblematic refugee and displaced camps, where people fleeing atrocities flock and then are confined to. And we have prisons, detention places. And I'd like to focus on prisons and detention places for a couple of reasons. First, because I think that this epitomizes the fate of so many millions of people confined, deprived of their liberty, confined in a prison for a lengthy period of time, with little or no control over their life, and their life is determined to a great extent by the design of those prisons and how it is then managed. I also select prisons because I think it's a distinct activity of ICRC as a humanitarian organization, starting in 1870, when the ICRC first visited prisoners of war. But of course, nowadays, last year we have visited over 940 detention places in many different contexts. And these are places which we have not built ourselves as International Committee of the Red Cross, but we can influence some of the reflections, especially when authorities decide to build new prisons. And it's particularly timely now because if you look at Africa, for instance, a lot of the prisons in use have been inherited from colonial times, and a good third of them might be abandoned and built anew outside of town, because they are now very much into these sprawling cities, and having the chance to discuss and have peers exchanging on what are the best and worst practices in terms of planning and designing new prisons with regards to the impact on humane conditions of detention is key. And we have gathered quite some experience that I want to share with you. Based on the experience shared by the delegates and those visiting detainees across the world, those engaging prison detention authorities, and also guards and staff working in these prisons, we came up with a reference book 5 years ago called Towards Humane Prisons, to provide a couple of basic principles and share reflections with authorities considering building or renovating detention places. And it's based very much on the so-called Nelson Mandela rules, or the UN minimum standards for the treatment of prisoners. And just a quote from the book, from the reference manual, which I think is quite interesting. And I quote, "The appearance of, access to, and design of the facilities affect the attitudes, expectations, and behavior of those who live and work in prisons. Prison design that supports expectations of pro-social behavior also facilitates safety and security, which in turn improves detainees' prospect for integrating back into their communities later." So you see the normative aspect that is taken in terms of thinking of prison as being part of societies and having a role to prepare and facilitate reintegration into society, rather than being those places which are outside of society and where people are supposed to stay in limbo forever. And I think this is a parti pris that is quite clear. The second point I want to highlight is a bit what you were saying, Jonathan, is that we can just try to humanize prisons by discussing about, how prison planning and design can contribute to more humane conditions of detention, but we can also engage more radically. And this is what we do when authorities plan to build a new prison. It's a time to more broadly discuss and assess the relevance, the effectiveness of criminal justice policies and practices with due regard to international standards and norms, but also to alternatives to detention. Because we know and think that there are indeed many alternative measures to detentions, and that deprivation of liberty should be done only when strictly necessary. Then it's also an opportunity to address well-known gaps and weaknesses in prison systems and management. And it's an opportunity, of course, to close substandard and decaying prisons where conditions are often abhorrent. So I think our colleagues who visit these places and visit detainees on a daily basis really very much grasp that the infrastructure, the design, the material that is used, even the colors, have an impact on the mental well-being, on the physical well-being, on inmates and prison staff, and it can either aggravate aggressiveness and tension, or to the contrary, contribute to ease them. What is key is to ensure access to essential needs, natural light, open air, to provide space for physical exercises, access to healthcare, these basic things, but also meaningful family visits and visits with loved ones, and this maintain a connection with society. And it was key as soon as the lockdown was imposed and really remained in place for a very extended period of time, years actually, in Asia and Latin America, where all visits of families in prisons were disrupted from one day to another, that we could, well, bring tablets and ways and means to have online visits even more frequently than the physical visit before, to maintain that link. Then the question of the principles, the fundamental principles are four. First, to maintain this connection between inmates and the outside society, where family visits is key, but also the possibility to have connections via, especially today, online means, to be kept abreast of what happens outside. This is also linked with the possibility for continuous personal development, with education, access to education, vocational training, and I would say spending time while confined in prison, deprived of liberty, to engage in personal developments. Then the promotion of health of detainees is key. Third principle is to maintain maximum normalcy. So what is normalcy is up for a conversation, but if we look at detention regimes in terms of the environment, access to outdoor spaces with some green, have a rhythm of life that is as normal as possible despite everything else. And I was surprised, for instance, visiting one of the most crowded and overpopulated prison in Southeast Asia, to see that even if the open space where inmates were able to gather was not thought as conducive, the inmates themselves had recreated a kind of a marketplace of sorts, where you got an impression of normalcy despite the rate of overcrowding, which was beyond anything else I had seen in my life before. So you see that inmates themselves, if they are provided just with the space to recreate some form of normalcy, immediately try to recreate these conditions. And finally, the do no harm, of course, with cells that have to have sufficient space, ventilation, and design which is adapted to also specific disabilities or aging population. To conclude, three conclusions. First, there is no one-size-fits-all, and we need really to integrate the question of cultural climate, and also the resources available, not only to build, but also to maintain properly these detention places. I think one other aspect with local solutions, that is my second conclusion, that local solutions must also build bottom up. Former detainees who have spent and experienced long period of detention are very precious resources in terms of informing conversations about planning and designing future prisons. And we have, as International Committee of the Red Cross, organized fora and groups at the regional level in Africa, in Asia, to bring together different stakeholders, including architects and designers involved in the planning of future prisons. And actually, by listening to ICRC experts, they might not really be so interested as to share notes between peers to say, okay, what have you built, for instance, in the neighboring country? How did it play out? How can we share and understand what has actually contributed to more humane conditions of detention, but also with some advantages for the staff of the prison working in it, and what has backlashed in terms of both security, safety, and conditions of detentions. And then hearing the voice of the detainees themselves is absolutely key. It's also something that we very much promote and that we can embed into planning. Finally, technology and innovation. You have mentioned it, Jonathan, quite a lot. It's key. We see today that in prisons, we have, of course, surveillance, or what you call surveillance methods that are ever more present. We have seen the introduction of algorithm and artificial intelligence with robots to take care of inmates, to be present in prison and partly manage prisons. This has given rise to horrendous situations where those who were there were saying, well, this can really completely spiral out of any control. So after all, what we see in some of the conversation that we are having on new means and methods of warfare, especially on autonomous weapon systems, applies also to the introduction of new technologies in prisons, in particular the need to retain human control, human decisions, and accountability with regard to the management of prison is absolutely key. That said, we have also seen that when we had, for instance, NATO troops or alliances for a couple of years waging a war in a given low-income country context, often they have contributed to build prison which requires a lot of energy, electricity, and so forth. And as soon as they leave, this is not working anymore because simply the electricity is not available anymore, and the maintenance is not ensured. So this can also create a huge problem that have to be factored into the fact that these prisons, as I was mentioning in the case of colonial prisons, which up to this day are still functional in many African and Asian countries, this had to be also factored into the reflections. So just a few reflections on prisons. I have a few of my colleagues who are the experts and know way more than I do who are around, but I will stop here and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gilles, also for recalling that we're actually interested in concrete technologies and concrete milieux and for listing them for us. Thank you so much. Javier, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I would like to ground a bit the discussion on the context of design in architectural terms, which is also the kind of expertise line we are working on within the project and also within the Department of Interior Architecture. And for many years and for many centuries, like the history of architecture has been told from the perspective of focusing on it as an autonomous kind of entity detached from kind of conditions of society, societal perspectives, because at first, actually, the history of the discipline was mainly written from art historians, and then the understanding of space quite often was based on planar surfaces from the facade to the inside, and from planar composition without really understanding kind of the complexities of the discipline as a kind of 3D form that actually mobilizes and produces and constructs kind of societies. I think that humanitarian design and humanitarian architecture are particularly important to measure the temperature of the discipline, both in historic terms and also in contemporary terms. And if we go back to the beginning of humanitarian architecture in its glossary of terms and what it means, and when we talk about humanitarianism in the context of space design, I would like to to go back to the end of the 19th century, when we would hear the terms refugee camps and concentration camp for the first time in the history of space design. So it happened first in Cuba. It was the first time when it was still property of the Spanish Empire. At the end of the 19th century, we would hear really these terms like concentration camp for the first time. And then it would be really implemented for the first time in the South African War, the Second Boer War, in which, because of the clashes between the different kind of groups being involved there, the British Empire would start creating camps that were architecturally very similar. So were typologically, they were really following the same pattern, but then some of them were for refugees, and then some of them were for housing people that were meant to be allies and therefore kind of recovered for the battleground, whereas others were kind of called concentration camps, and they were mainly meant for prisoners and for people to be killed and exterminated. I think that at the same time, at the end of this was really 1899, and then the war would extend for 3 years. And at the same time, we were kind of seeing these architectural mechanisms and devices being implemented in the battlefields. Like the discipline itself was entering a moment of total revolution and disruption with the emergence of what would be later called modern and modernistic architecture, starting off in the European context and then moving to North America with a series of exhibitions. It's interesting because at that moment, we see like the battlefields implementing architecture of concentration camps and refugee camps that would always be photographed from the outside in most of the cases, and with a distant point of view, so that we would almost never see the human beings close to architecture. So architecture was reified, so we wouldn't neither see the kind of recovery nor the suffering of kind of humans within the context of architecture. And it really felt as if it was a scale model, always with a distant point of view. Interestingly enough, the modernity of architecture within the European discussion and context, with a series of congresses that were kind of directed in the first place by Le Corbusier, and they were called the Congrès International of Architecture Moderne, the CIAM, started producing the same kind of images in which, like urban planning, that was like the default mechanism of modernization in the first decades of the 20th century. Buildings were always seen from the outside again. So it was a very similar composition in terms of the fabrication of the image of architecture. And then the more we delve into the details of the evolution of the discipline in the 20th century, we see that official architecture, the one that was shown in different biennials, taught in the schools, represented in exhibitions, so on and so forth, would get progressively rid of the humans in its representation. So the moment we would kind of try to enter this architecture of social housing or museums or public buildings, quite often, like most of the images would not incorporate human bodies and human presence, whereas in the kind of non-told history of humanitarian architecture, humans were always quite present, actually, because for different reasons, they were always quite close to architecture, because architecture had a different scale, had a different size, and the moment you put the camera inside interior spaces, humans were there. This is extremely interesting as a phenomenon of a discipline that has evolved like in two different directions for many years. And now, over the last 20 years, architectural theory and criticism has been trying to put the everyday, the ordinary, the presence of society and human beings, but also the non-human, at the center of a space, trying to get detached from the idea that architecture is a neutral container. And it happens that all of a sudden, humanitarian architecture, humanitarian design, with all its political implications and controversies and problematics, feels way more contemporary and even kind of sometimes kind of refreshing in terms of how we understand the discipline than the official kind of architecture that has been told and published through a lot of kind of professional magazines in the architectural discussion. So we meet at a crucial moment in which humanitarian design and humanitarian architecture by population, it would be like the 60th country on Earth in terms of population. It's producing cities that are kind of labeled to be transient in most of the cases, but that they remain and stay on place for decades. becoming forms of permanent ephemerality, basically, because they are solidified under the appearance of precarity and under the reality and difficulty of precarity, but they stay for decades, with humans spending 17 years of their lives on average inside refugee camps, with a lot of human beings who have never been outside refugee camps. So humanitarian architecture is very, very critical for understanding the contemporaneity of the discipline. And in the project, we will be trying to deconstruct the old a prioris and the old paradigms of the discipline. We will try to look at and to render visible what's going on in a diversity of architectures in different locations worldwide. First, trying to render that visible for the discipline and for humanitarian design and policy, but also trying to understand what that implies for the discipline and how that can transform the discipline, not only for humanitarian design and practices, but also for the practice of architecture itself. Because by addressing the contradictions of the official historiography of architecture and the urgency and contemporaneity of humanitarian design and architecture, we can really reshape also the future of our discipline, of the discipline of space design, architecture, and interior architecture. And last but not least, I would like to elaborate a bit on a few images we have seen so far under the title, The Interiors of Humanitarian Architecture, which is already a course that we are teaching with master students at Geneva, but also with the PhD candidates from the program that are also today here in the room. And again, it tells the story of how we try to unravel the hidden kind of narratives of humanitarian stories that happen within the framework of architecture. And by trying to understand what is happening within the interiors of humanitarian architecture, by trying to get rid of the default Google image that you find when you kind of Google refugee camps, in which quite often you only see the exterior of architecture, by trying to do a portrait of the lives happening within these precarious architectures of containers, of tents, etc., we can really not only tell the stories of the people living there, but also understand how design can be transformed in the 21st century to address these challenges. And it is something we are starting to work on from here, from Geneva, but then also we aim to travel there, and we are getting in touch with local communities there with a series of emails and of interviews, and we will keep you posted about the further developments of the project that is just started. But yeah, thanks a lot, and also like very happy also to see the other team members in the room with us.
Yes, thanks a lot, Javier, and thanks for coming. Please pass the word.
So, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for having me on the panel. I've taken many notes and learned a lot just listening to you. I'm very happy I come in fourth and first in this conversation. I'll be very honest with you and share how I am approaching this research, because the word is, I think, correct, approaching, and it's a pretty good sign. When my colleague Elisa, I'd like to acknowledge her presence here, Elisa Ruska, who is our Director of Exhibitions and Collections, when we start thinking about, how could we tell this story in a museum, in our museum, that's a pretty good sign that we're curious and that there's something bigger to share. So we're actually not the ICRC Museum, we're the International Red Cross Red Crescent Museum, which is interesting because it means that we're not part of ICRC, but ICRC sits on our board, we are members of the movement, of course, but we have this interesting third space where we can also develop critical thinking about all the different issues at stake when you try to do this work of humanitarian action. And my colleagues and I, in everything we do, this can be from an exhibition to, do we still say tweet? Well, we try to answer a question, or at least provide answers to a question, which is, what does humanitarian action have to do with me in my life, here and now? And we therefore state that our knowledge is situated. This here and now is here and now. It's in Geneva, in a peaceful city. We also state that we don't have the answers, but we're good at asking questions and creating the conditions for an interdisciplinary conversation around matters that we're never going to simplify because they're complex, but how can we make people feel they belong to a conversation that fundamentally has to do with how we decide to live together in society. When we say, what does it have to do with me in my life here and now, it also means that we fundamentally say that humanitarian action is not someone else's problem. It's not connected to otherness. It's not over there. It's not in a screen that goes away when you switch off your phone, and there's no idea that it's someone else's issue. So it's very self-reflective, and I think you leave our museum with more questions than you had when you arrived. So bear with me, I'm approaching the topic. Then, if you look at the museum as a space, it's a very complicated space. It's very loaded with assumptions, representations, very complex history. Museums have been seen and have behaved as places of privilege and entitlement. They have been agents of colonialism. There's a lot going on in the museum space in itself. I mean, in our Western culture, we've also been taught to be quiet, not to touch, to perhaps not say you haven't understood, and to experience this space in a certain way. And my colleagues and I fundamentally question that as well, because we think that we can experience the design and the space of a museum very differently and see it more as a forum for a conversation than a temple, especially when you're on top of a hill here in Geneva. So why am I interested in this research? I'm interested in this research because it questions a space I myself hadn't personally questioned enough, and I think that's a good sign too. I'm not a humanitarian worker, so I'm pretty much in the shoes of the people who walk into the museum and wonder about things connected to humanitarian action. And this idea of essentializing through architecture and design is super interesting, and everything you said about how the lived experience and the continuum of architecture and design has nothing to do with this bird's-eye view of what it could be, is something we are super interested in, because at the same time we curate and imagine exhibitions that enable to question assumptions. We've worked a lot on photography, for example. People, and I always include myself when I say this, are submitted to images of humanitarian contexts every day. You switch on the news and you see images of humanitarian situations, and you can quickly think that they are worth 1,000 words and that you've understood just by seeing, but actually, of course, you haven't. And when you have field experience, you know that there's so much more to it, but it's also a competency to be able to question photography and what photography shows and doesn't show about humanitarian situations. So we did big shows, and Elisa just curated a huge show called Humankind, which I invite you to see, which offers, perhaps opens a perspective of how differently we could look at humanitarian situations without essentializing people, without giving them pre-designed roles in a narrative that we've been carrying forever in Western culture. We've done that also in the field of gender. We've done that, and we're doing that in the field of sound. We're looking at the sound collections of the Red Cross with Crescent movement right now. Mind-blowing. Whose voice do we hear? Whom do we listen to? Hence the interest in the idea of, wow, design. So what could that space be? What kind of story could we tell? And I put a lot of importance on this idea of telling a story, because stories are powerful. They come along with a lot of responsibility, how you tell the story, from which perspective. And we, at the end of the day, are always in space. So it's also very pragmatic. In the museum, you sell a ticket, you walk into a space, you understand something, you leave, and you make that space live. So there is also a connection which seems very relevant and interesting to me. And on a broader perspective, it's also an idea of how a museum, and especially a museum that talks about humanitarian action, could in itself be an agent of care in society, could in itself be something that lives up to humanitarian principles and tries to best serve its community, not by pretending it's something else than a museum in a very privileged city. So that's more or less what I am.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. And of course, I can unfortunately let only guys speak, so I have to say something. But I'll do it very brief. rest assured, so that we can have some discussion. And there are many ways of approaching something like this. And I just wanted to sort of throw some ideas into the discussion about what I am concerned with and what kind of research paths I think are very important actually for our project. And I'm just opening one of them. We've opened a number of paths here. And the one I want to open is the one about the role of the commercial in humanitarian design. Because of course we live in a world that's largely governed through markets, and we now learn through Gilles that even prison inmates create normality by forming a little market inside their prison. And of course this has been enormously criticized from all kinds of points of view. But I also think it's a reality. So as far as I'm concerned, the radical militant design that Jonathan was talking about before is going to take place in the market. And one of the slides you've been seeing going here is the ADEX that takes, so a big expo with different kinds of actors exposing material about humanitarianism and how to conduct humanitarianism. And it's a very important place actually for governing a fair like that. You form values, you form an understanding of how things should be governed. You even have a global empowerment mission you've also been seeing coming by here on the side. So this for me, how do we live with this reality? How do we deal with the fact that our radicalness and so on is going to have to be squeezed in there somehow? And I just want to sort of throw in 3 ideas about things I think are very important. So the first one is an idea about responsiveness. And of course, markets are very responsive. And if there's one thing that's been very, very strongly criticized, everyone who's opened the first, approaching this topic, Pascal, the IKEA Best Shelter project, a big company, one of the biggest in the world, creating a cheap structure and so on. It's been enormously criticized for all kinds of reasons, including the bad materials and so on. IKEA, of course, has responded to this and changed the materials. So now it's just a structure and it can be adopted and it can be made much better. As far as I'm concerned, this is very nice, but not quite enough. And this is one of the things I'd like to think about. So how could one move from just responding to being proactive? So this project is about violence prevention in different ways. So how can one make proactively projects in design that serve purposes that we think are important? And I'm not sure I know we're starting, and I'm not sure even when we end talking about approaching that I will have the perfect answer. But I think it's a very important question to ask oneself. How does one get to the proactive and to anchoring that in markets? The second thing I want to throw in there is an idea of refocusing. So a lot of humanitarian design really has been focused very narrowly on objects and the people who create them. So it's not by chance. We have a lot of designers and engineers who work together on this. But I think we need to think more in terms of connections. And of course, again, responsiveness, markets, and so on. So the need, we've heard already, the need to connect to the local, to the context, to the specific. And this is super important. But it's also important to realize that the local and the contextual and so on has a context, belongs to something broader. So the commercial dynamics that we're looking at, of course, aren't only taking place in the IKEA shelter, in the specific refugee camp that you're looking at. They're connected to a whole world of commercial dynamics. And how to get those dynamics into view is something that's very much at the core, I think, of the interest and why it's important to actually bring in people like Jonathan and myself, social scientists. Sorry to put us up a little bit here, but also people who are interested in theory and rendering the museum critical and translating that into practice. It's actually very important to make those connections and to think about how one can make them work better. So an idea of refocusing to something that's locally connected to something larger. And then I have a third idea that a third path, and this is really for the sake of discussion, I think is very important to think about, sort of rethink the way. So if I just said that I think it's important to have people like us work on humanitarian design, it actually means rethinking our disciplines and rethinking how we think about working in our respective disciplines. And this is something that we have been very good at paying lip service to, but that our disciplines, and it doesn't matter for architecture, political scientists, or curators, there are all kinds of institutional and sociological structures that are a very, very powerful reality and that make that very complicated. And they're, of course, profoundly commercial. So you've noticed a little incredible thing there. I think the ways in which academics tend to present themselves as profoundly disinterested, and of course we're all completely against commercial interests, except when it comes to branding ourselves and our research projects, and we're super effective at it, and then we'll happily kill off any competition there is. So how to achieve something where we're more capable of actually looking critically at how we're working and taking those dynamics into account and turning them so that we can actually work with them rather than have them work against us. So it's both about questioning the disciplines. I put up the image from, I have to say, Rosanna, sorry, blackout. Anyway, Rosanna Paulinho, so it's fantastic Brazilian artist who puts up the bone to show you the racism and the problematic nature of science, and at the same time stitches it together and says, for love of science with a question mark. And I think we need something like that in our respective disciplines. So I just wanted to throw that in there, and then I'll try to put on my hat as a chair again and a thumbs up. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. And I'd like to open up for a round of sort of reacting to each other and coming back. So, Jonathan, you went first. You want to go first on this one again? Let's just go the same order. You have reactions to each other. Quick comment on something?
Yeah, thanks everyone for the amazing interventions. I feel they connect quite nicely, actually, and I want to focus on one of the dilemmas that actually I think Pascal talked about in terms of the museum as a kind of agent of care, and this kind of the fundamental tension of what we're talking about, which is of course the tension for all humanitarian action, but I think it cuts across, when you're talking about the redesign of prisons in very concrete places. It's kind of an act of care, which then also involves bringing in, of course, the detainees and even former detainees, as you talked about, who are getting advice on, but it's also this movement between care and a kind of paternalism that is, of course, necessary.
Can you speak up, Jonathan?
Sorry,
I can't hear you here in the back. Sorry.
It's working? Ah, fuck, sorry.
Yes, perfect.
A movement between a kind of care and paternalism, which is always in this tension, right? That it's necessary to make difficult choices in any of the positions that we're speaking from. We have a certain amount of power and authority to influence particular things. And this is very clear in prison detention policy, which then connects very nicely to what Javier was talking about in terms of the discipline of architecture and how this has evolved in terms of the concentration camps that you were talking about, the design of these facilities and the immense power of kind of architecture as a field that implements, a form of technologization in urban environments, but all environments, whether interior or exterior. And then, Pascal, on the museum too, the tensions within the museum, which Bataille talked about the museum as a slaughterhouse, there's kind of these connections between them too. So, we have prisons, kind of concentration camps, and I was going in a dark place as these went forward in terms of basically the tension between authority and care and how you balance that and how much autonomy you give, which is something we'll struggle with across this kind of project, Autonomy in the local, yes, but coming from positions of power. And then this connecting to the commercial particularly strongly, the commercial being a very dirty space that we're reluctant to talk about, but is actually quite open about that movement between, you know, being very careful for people, but also from a very strong position of power and manipulation. So I've been dwelling mostly on this kind of question of care, which we've all touched upon. Yeah, that was mainly my, I have diagrams, but I won't share them.
Thank you. Gilles?
Maybe two comments. The first one on the question of commercial actors and local solutions. For instance, in 2013, 2014, you had about 1.2 million Syrians moving and fleeing to Lebanon. And immediately, indeed, commercial actors teamed up with humanitarian agencies to propose off-the-shelf solution for both shelter and schools. And back then, I was not with the ICRC, I was simply with the Graduate Institute and as an invited professor in Lebanon, in Beirut. And I was struck by the fact that the architecture faculty mobilized themselves, students, faculty members, and they came up with new prototypes that they wanted to fund and implement. So they got foundations in Germany and elsewhere funding their project, and they started in the Bekaa Valley to establish their own solutions. And I went with a car to open a school with them, and the funder from Germany was saying, "Why did you do all that?" And he said, "We were outraged by the standards of what was proposed by commercial actors. And when we have seen what it meant for our brothers and sisters from Syria, we couldn't stand it, and we have invested ourselves immediately in trying to find solutions because we are architects, we are training young architects," and they reacted. And I think this is, something, a driver that is very much there, that provide immediate checks and balances and options for alternative solutions. Now, it relates a bit to your comment on disciplines and revisiting our epistemological foundations, where, me as an economist, of course, I would look at data. I would try to see if I could have a quasi-natural experiment being implemented to, do an impact evaluation based on hard facts, as we call them, data, and try to out of that, measure the impact of different interventions and what seems to be better than others. And that's where I think we need to challenge these approaches with ethnographic inquiry methods, where we go much more towards narratives, perceptions, and how people actually report, how they simply engage with the built environment around them, and how this impinges upon not only the direct objective that is, for instance, a school. Do you attend school and do you follow classes? But what it means in terms of having a process of integration or rejection or feeling left aside, what it means in terms of the possibility of feeling having a more dignified life, despite the fact that you lost everything when you had to move, and all the rest, which is absolutely ignored in the direct type of monodisciplinary analysis that I would do as an economist. And you're right that this opening, we are very much saying and repeating it, but it's not yet there, despite the fact that we know that it's the best way to add a catastrophe to a disaster, to take a monodisciplinary approach. And it's also what we need within our own staff. By the way, at the ICRC, we have a lot of very distinguished architects, anthropologists, and you name them. But this interdisciplinary dialogue within organizations, cross-sector, is also absolutely key to get our acts together. And then the profit motive and the question of commercial actors bringing their own solutions. It's interesting because, you could see that it spurred a reaction, which you may also see as a sort of competition, to say, oh, we have our own solution, which is better, and we'll raise funds and we'll show that what we do is better than what has been proposed by commercial actors. And as you say, commercial actors are very quick then to react, especially to bad press. And what happened is mostly that what was meant to be the schools has been used for toilets, and after a while it wasn't even being possible to use these as toilets anymore. So the bed press is immediate, and they react very quickly to the fact that, what they could feature as, good heart and making the world a better place, backlashes as you are, actually vilifying people who already endured so much. And that's absolutely, as you say, a trigger that might help, push them to bring other solutions. But always, I think what is necessary is to keep this in check, and it's the role of humanitarian organizations to do their job, to ensure that whether public or private suppliers across the supply chain, what ends up to be proposed is really up to minimal standards and learning by doing.
Good luck.
Well, I guess that it's also part of the discussion, like to open it up to the audience later. So I imagine that. So I would be happy also to get some insights and feedback from the audience. But I think that of all the presentations, I was thinking while listening at all of you that actually there is also a common thread that was very present in all the presentation, which is like the relationship between in the case of the drones, or in the case of prisons, or the museums, etc., of the camera and the point of view as an apparatus of production of agency and autonomy, and how it relates to human agency, basically. So it seems that, at least from what came to my mind while listening to the different presentation, there is this moment in which the farther and the more alienated the camera and the more detached the camera is from the human eye, we enter into kind of mechanisms of control. This is very clear in the case of drones, but also it's very clear in the history of prisons, that in different periods across history they were linked to the idea of the panopticon, so that you could have a centralized point of view of control, and there is an asymmetry of vision because the person who controls and who does the surveillance normally looks at the inmates through different thresholds of barriers, mechanisms of control. So there is an asymmetry of power in the way you construct like the human vision and how it's portrayed through a kind of mechanism of seeing. And also in the moment you also apply this kind of rationale to museums, how you frame, how you display content, how you look at content, etc. It's always the construction of a mechanism of display. And I think that part of a large discussion also in terms of design is how to give back the control of the camera to the human eyes of the people who are inhabiting humanitarian architecture, because I think that the more detached the production of images is from the people who are looking at these spaces in first place, I think that the more we enter into mechanisms of totalitarianism. And as a radical kind of hypothesis, that also like in terms of mechanisms of design, like the project also at a certain point we will be confronted with that, is if we look at the figures and at the numbers and at the statistics, like should also like, I don't know, like refugee camps or cities of humanitarianism or territories of humanitarian design give political agency to the refugees, we run as democracies, etc. So these are questions that are very much related to the point of view and who is looking at it and who has the control of these eyes and this multiplicity of eyes who are looking at this space. Mm-hmm. So for me, this is a fascinating hypothesis that really touches upon the idea of design as its very basis, because a very important genealogy of design is linked to the production of the camera and to the production of images that are originally coming from the human eye, but as a matter of fact, they produce a multiplicity of perspectives at point of view.
Hmm.
Super, thanks.
I would like to just reflect with you a bit on power, because I think that's it's the bedrock everywhere, and to me it's an extremely strong topic to frontally address in the museum space, because museums are and have been seen as places of power, period. So how, and this was my big question when I got the job, how can we share that power? And how can we be sure it's used as a catalyst and it creates agencies in the plural, because there are so many different ways of creating agency around the museum, as opposed to being a space for ourselves and where people come to us and we get to lecture them and so on. And it's tough to do that, because we're questioning a model that's been in place forever. But I'd like to just share with you a few thoughts. One is by identifying themes that are relevant in many different communities, in many different conversations, in communities that don't talk to each other, and using the space of the museum as a platform to create and have these people meet and reflect together. And I don't say this as a fancy thing. Actually, I'm very pragmatic in my work with my colleagues. So the first theme we addressed over 18 months was gender and diversity, because it's an everyday live conversation, because it's a huge conversation in the humanitarian sector, and because it's a conversation in the world of art and research. How can we, the museum, bring that together? So we created and curated huge shows on this question, casting, for example, a new light at the history of humanitarian action through gender, a big research we did with the University of Geneva. But it's good to say things publicly. It's even better to question yourself as a structure and as a company. So we also were audited for 18 months and became the first museum in Switzerland to be certified as a Swiss LGBTI-friendly employer. And that's when it gets interesting, is when you start to walk the talk and to actually be that space. So I just was looking up for the definition of what could a feminist and inclusive museum be? Because after this 18 months of research on gender and diversity, we published a toolkit. It's on our website and it's free to download if you're interested. 10 ideas for feminist museum. We've just published 10 ideas for caring museum. And this is Rebecca Amsterdam's definition. I'm going to read it to you. Rebecca conducted this research with us, and it's interesting, I think, for everything we talked about. A feminist and inclusive museum should acknowledge its role as a power broker, an aim to demasculinize its heritage and lend legitimacy to avant-garde social themes. To do so, it should commit to spotlighting neglected female and non-binary creators and presenting diverse forms of masculinity. It should support advanced research in intersectional and feminist disciplines that have received little funding from universities. The public, rather than being considered passive visitors, should be active agents in the exhibitions. And that's really how we understand a museum. And if an exhibition comes out of this, our visitors will be active agents, and it will be an opportunity for everyone involved with, and I'll finish on that, something else I find super interesting and important. It's to situate our knowledge. I mean, it's very important, I think, to be transparent in how we created the stories we share in the museum space, acknowledge that they're situated, that it's the best we could do, that we worked with such and such people, that we approached from this angle, and that's how we can not patronize or not, I mean, be an agent of care for real and not like top-down condescending ways. At least I hope, and that's what we work for.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I have this feeling we have a lot on the table now, and I'll use my prerogative as a chair not to make a big statement, trying to sum this up, but thank you very much. Maybe just one thing after all, I'm very happy to hear that you've been certified and that I now know what it's like to be a feminist museum. But I'm also, on a more serious note, I'm saying that because it's very actually interesting to have the different spaces in which we're working and in which this project is actually taking place and unfolding. And I think it comes out very clearly when you listen to this panel. So I'm very grateful actually to you for putting this out there. But now I'd like to open up and yes, please, Jonathan, yes.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. This is really exciting project, and it's really cool to see all these different profiles and people on the panel and apparently in the room, and all these different disciplines and practitioners and theory, etc. I'm a student here at the Institute. I'm in my last semester of the interdisciplinary program. Currently writing a thesis on humanitarian innovation and accountable governance of corporate technologies. So definitely a lot of linkages here, but more from the technology and innovation side of things. I had a question about, like, it's a broad question, I guess, about framing definitions and analytical categories for the project. Now, I understand obviously there's a lot of different research and activities, but at the larger scale, and maybe you're still figuring this out, I'm wondering, how do you approach, for example, the category or how do you define design, right? I mean, for me, the critique of humanitarian design, of humanitarian innovation, which I find really cogent and compelling, one of the issues I have with it is, being that it's a critique and a theoretical critique, it works a lot at the level of monolithic schematics. And, you know, for example, this Mark Duffield is one writer in this field, very influential name in terms of innovation technologies, who talks about adaptive design, has a critique of adaptive design, which is very interesting, but at the same time, you know, having a background also in design research and human-centered design, you know, I found it interesting to see his critique of design, because for me, there's a lot of actually empowerment or opportunities, prospects, actual potential to kind of revolutionize the way, you know, technologies or structures are done if you have a real human-centered or even human rights-centered design approach. And so what kind of design are we talking about? And are there forms of design that, and anyway, if we can disentangle that. And likewise, humanitarian, you know, we're talking about the humanitarian sector, can't really just treat it as a monolith. You know, if we have a more critical sort of governance approach, we see there's a lot of different actors and things going on. And are there actually already answers and things being done in the humanitarian sector that are, and it sounds, you know, we've mentioned a few things that are actually already pushing in the direction of what you're talking about, of a more militant, or even if it's not a militant, a more, you know, a different, less corporate capture version of design. And, you know, one example I'm thinking of through my research is the International Rescue Committee, the IRC, has this Airbell Impact Lab that's very tech agnostic, almost tech skeptical in its approach to design. But at the same time, the organization is also in many other ways really, you know, indicative of corporate capture or techno-solutionism. So yeah, breaking down those monoliths and framing definition and categories. Thanks.
I have a question for Professor Carbonnier.
Introduce yourself.
Thomas Gmuil. I'm doing a PhD in here at the Graduate Institute in Political Science. I was very interested and intrigued by this notion of bringing a sense of normalcy back. And paradoxically, what you described as sort of this reintroduction of a form of market or sort of other relationship, it almost sounds as if it's a return of abnormalcy, right? Or that the space of the prison is an extremely normed space where like I imagine the daily relationships are also extremely normed, and what perhaps these inmates are longing for with the return of a certain life is the messiness, right, of the outside world, the fact that you encounter on a daily basis forms of frictions in interactions. And obviously the prison is extremely difficult because of the security focus. But I was thinking of, with this discussion of care, with, for instance, the hospital, which is also extremely difficult to change. We have very fragile life in there, but there is a sense that with the difference between an extremely vocal nurse and someone who's perhaps more silent, or in the way the doors are opened very aggressively by some and very slowly by others, you have these variations in the interactions with the environment and with the people there that brings a sense of messiness and of abnormalcy, perhaps, that is also fostering of emancipation in those spaces. Is this bringing back of normalcy in the prison for you also the bringing back of abnormalcy, if that makes sense?
Okay. Do you want to start, Pascal? Do you want to comment on that?
Well, it's funny, we should, I just wrote down definitions, and we just had this conversation earlier before the panel with my colleague Elisa about, you know, she asked the question, okay, so how do you define design? How do you define violence? That's something to me that I connect with the huge challenge of interdisciplinary research and collaboration between different institutions. How many times in my career I've noted that we think we use the same words, but actually we don't put the same meaning in them. And then we go straight into a wall. So we're going to try to avoid this. But that's all I can say about design. I'm just as curious as you to see how they define it. And I can make this a bigger conversation of everything in the museum is designed. So how can we use the museum as an echo chamber of the research and kind of show and reveal the design thinking that goes around designing an actual exhibition and the added layers of meaning that this brings in. That would be super interesting. And open source is something we do a lot in the museum field, or actually, I think we do. I'm not sure if I'm very representative of the museum field, but we do a lot of that. I mean, during COVID, for example, we designed a big international exhibition and archive live with our communities, and this was co-designed and is now kept in our museum. In September next year, we're co-publishing a book with 9,000 people. And researchers of the University of Geneva and ourselves. So it's really cool, actually, because that's where the most challenging stuff is, but the most enriching. About the monolith, I could only agree with you, and this is why. So we are the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Museum, but it would be wrong to only speak about humanitarian action in this specific context. We need to put it into context as well, because there are other ways of thinking it and other ways of approaching it that helps us better understand the specificities, the challenges, the issues of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, past, present, and future. So yeah, music to my ears, really. And I invite you to see a series of a photographer whose name I'm forgetting because I'm so bad at names, who's in our current exhibition, Humankind, and he talks about homeless people in Brazil and how they decided to get back their dignity and live together in the late years of their lives. And they just happened to be sex workers who were just dying on the streets. And one of them said, well, to hell with it, we can also have dignity. And the photographer spent several months with them learning how they live, creating trust. And it's their story she shows in a very dignified way. So anyway, that's different things I thought I could share.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, please.
Yeah.
I know. Jonathan? Julie?
Well, maybe the question of normalcy, which is an excellent question. Because I think, as Javier was saying, the average time of displacement nowadays is kind of 20 years. So for many children and teenagers, normalcy is being displaced and living in a camp and dealing with it. We have many conflicts that have been there for 3 generations in a row. So Afghanistan or elsewhere, being in a country either under sanction and or where you have an armed conflict with cycles of open hostilities is normal. And you have to deal, and I mean, you know, become an adult, father, mother, grandfather, mother, in this environment, which is the way what you get. So it's all extremely relative, and when we say restoring, averting to have people losing all sense of normalcy, what personally I was struck is a bit what I saw in the museum, also in some of the pictures that show Syria in the midst of bombardments and conflict, but you see actually that people have their lives, and if you don't see the plane and then the bomb a kilometer away, life seems almost normal if you don't get the subtitles of where it's being shooted and why. So I think we have to reflect on that and to see this diversity. Now, on the very specific question of normalcy in prisons, I will tell you that I raised the same kind of question to my colleagues who are really the one dealing on a daily basis on how do you concretely deal in terms of planning and architectures of prisons to that. And I don't want to push the mic on anyone, but I wonder if just on this question, this quick question of normalcy, with all the experience that either of my colleagues, architects or head of our detention at the ICSE, you wish to maybe add a number of reflections, if you wish.
That would be very kind of you, yes. Are you willing to do that? Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Terry Hackett. I'm the head of the Persons Deprived of Liberty Unit at the ICRC. It's a very interesting question when you talk about normalcy in a place of detention. And I've been working in places of detention since I was 19, so my whole professional career. And it's really a matter of how you define normalcy as well. So when we look at normalcy inside of a place of detention, you sort of mentioned about longing to be with sort of the chaotic parts of the community. I can tell you right now, a place of detention are very chaotic as well. There's systems, there's subsystems, there's power dynamics. It reflects community outside. And so when we talk about normalcy in design, and I'll hand it over to Jean-Marc, who's our lead in terms of architecture and water and habitat and detention for the ICRC. When we talk about that, we talk about making sure that when again, as Jill said, we don't build prisons. ICRC does not build prisons. We influence design. We try to influence humanitarian principles around design. And so when we talk about that, it's about building that space that reinforces what an open regime is, normalcy can even be the times you eat. So are you eating at the same times as the community versus, but we see in some places around the world, people have their last meal at 2 PM and then they don't eat until 6 AM the next day. Well, the community takes meals much later. So we talk about what is normalcy with the outside community. And so how does the design reinforce what the place of detention should ultimately be is a basis for reintegration back to society. And I'll turn that over to Jean-Marc to maybe share a bit about the architecture and design piece from that.
Thanks. Trying to bounce back on this. Now, we always think when we discuss with authorities to link with the architecture and how you operate your prison. And I take the example of the food, for example. You might think that in all prisons in the world, you have kitchen, you deliver food to the detainees, and voila, that's it. In fact, in some area, people eat in a kind of a cafeteria. In some areas, they eat at their cell. So how you bring the food to the cell, how you manage the waste. In some areas, they receive food, and after they re-cook the food in some specific area, the meal, it's really something very important in a daily life of the prisoner. So how do you integrate this when you do your design? Because if it's a communal kitchen or kind of a cell kitchen, it's totally different to operate and thus to design. And then after you have this type of normality, we try to bring also to have in terms of light, in terms of perspective from the cell, to see something else than just concrete block with gray colors, with the sound of concrete, the sound of iron doors that close and open, and always something that echo in the prison. So how you diminish this and how the architect can work on this in terms of materiality, in terms of space, in terms of natural light, and so on. And after having this schedule of normality, what time you go to sleep, when you go to the room, the classroom, when you can receive families, and the family is not like a simple room where you just come from the, let's say, the outside world until the room where you meet your loved one. Imagine a family with the kids going to see the father or the mother. There is kind of a transition from the street up to the family visitation room. And how do you give a sense of normality about this on both sides? And all this thematic of architecture about transition, about public and personal space, day and night, it's all there in prison, in a very concentrated area. It's really what we call a walled community. And for all of us, the prison is just a wall. It speaks about security, that's it. And we dump people there for a few years, and after they go out, in fact, full life is there. So we have to integrate this. And this is what we try to develop with normality. So if there's architect in the room, welcome to join the club, because we need really to develop all those aspects, because it's so important, because there you have an impact which is fantastic for the people deprived of liberty.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. I use this as an excuse to say something about the definition questions. And I like the way you started off saying it really depends on how you define normality and get this discussion. So definitions actually are extremely political and extremely useful for different things. They make us see different things. And actually, so in the project, of course, we have a quite, on the one hand, very specific definition of design as forming objects, but it goes out to Mignolo's kind of definition, which is about making worlds. And as far as I'm concerned, this is not walking into a wall. It's quite the opposite when we think about what definitions do for us, allowing for both movement, but also for the fact that we have different kinds of definitions of the same term can be extremely helpful. So just two ways in which this is the case to make it a little bit more concrete. So in the sense that the misunderstandings that come with definitions and allowing, if you're thinking that you're starting an interdisciplinary project, it's actually quite important to allow for the different definitions to coexist and the tensions between them to be there, precisely because it depends on how you define normality. And the other way is queering definitions. So, you know, the fact that we have different, that definitions move and that they're contradictory and they queer out on the side, they deviate. So queer theory, the ways of not fixing definitions too tightly is actually quite important. Now, so this is why I don't think this is about walking into a wall. On the other hand, of course, there are very concrete things you want the definitions to do for you. So in that sense, you know, we actually have, Gilles mentioned them before, we're working with 3 very concrete technologies, trying to design them in a very sort of concrete practice of design. So I hope that clarifies a little bit the status of that discussion. Thank you. Yes. And I would have, and that would apply now. I talked more about the design bit of this, Jonathan, than the humanitarian bit. But of course, it's similarly for humanitarianism. Thank you.
I'm Svetlana Ovcharenko. I'm a visiting fellow in Institute. Thank you very much for this project. It's an incredible idea to combine together different sectors. But I have one general doubt about the very close use to notion prisoners and refugees. Maybe this embodied a special humanitarian position because this fact confused me a lot, and maybe when we separate to these notions, we will have some new aspects of humanitarian design, and I try to imagine this beautiful board with well-designed concentrate space, this camp, and I understand that something wrong in our general humanitarian position. Maybe this sociological or philosophical background could be present in your further discussion. Thank you.
So my name is Negar. I'm last year PhD candidate in the International Law Department. I think the project starts by zooming on a specific space and scenario. And I'm thinking what we would see if we see the humanitarian project as reinforced state of loss of access to means of social reproduction. So this is in a way moving away from the idea of vulnerability, which is of course is a symptom of loss of sovereignty, and really thinking long term about loss of communal sovereignty and humanitarian spaces being the very high level reinforced version of the broader loss of access of masses to means of social reproduction, and as you said, long-term process of vulnerability by looking at more sovereignty and loss of that, basically. Thank you.
My name is Sanjna, and I'm a second-year master's student in anthropology. I guess my question relates to the previous question in some sense, but when thinking about design and the sites in which, I guess, design is enacted, it seems to me that the conversation kind of tends to focus on design being enacted out there in the humanitarian settings of suffering of the others. And to me, the discussion on museums was quite relevant because it brings back the conversation to the design of the institutions themselves. And I would like to kind of hear some reflections on what does it mean to think about design of humanitarian bureaucracies, humanitarian practices within these bureaucracies, and what does it mean to turn that eye in spaces, definitely as museums, but also widely, more wider, as my colleague there, but maybe across the system or structures. So
I think this was an excellent question to start, which takes me back a bit to something Gilles said about the number of prisons that are still, based on kind of colonial, are actually colonial prisons or designs based on colonial structures. Because I think that's, we talk about institutions and we talk about a difference between here and now. The humanitarian sector, of course, depending on how you define it, I'm going to avoid definitions. Depending on how you define it, it has a very strong linkage to, colonial structures, power structures, and so on and so forth. And the legacy of that, to come to the question of design, what design is to me, is for me one of the particular interests in this project. You can think about, if we think about design in the Duffield complex adaptive system sense, I'm less interested in that, although it has a place to be a kind of an ideational form of design that is separate from the materiality of the process, whether architectural or very basic technological. I mean, my interest from this very specifically comes also from detention settings, prison design, mainly in the Middle East, and the way in which very small designed objects affect people's behavior, and precisely the way you were talking about, Gilles, and both of you were talking about the metal sounds, the echoes, the colors in different spaces, that design is creating particular effective environments that change people's behavior from architectural schematics down to objects themselves. And the colonial legacies through which those are produced and remain circulated and disseminated across space and time, what a sense of normalcy means and how that connects to different settings. I also have actually some questions on the ICRC's role in this, because normalcy also depends in different settings. So when you were speaking, Gilles, I was thinking also, supermax prisons in the US, and specifically designed to deny normalcy for prisoners in a even more extreme sense than some of the settings we'll look at. So this is me, by the way, trying to answer as many of these as possible, as quickly as possible. But I think that was an excellent point there in terms of one of our specific concerns is to avoid the idea of these problems being somewhere else, because obviously they are, if you look in a quantitative sense, but the roots of a lot of these problems, institutionally, structurally, ideationally, come from places in Western Europe and the designs of institutions, humanitarian, but also the state itself. So keeping that in mind is very crucial for how I think about this. Design also as a condensation of historical processes, which we're still reckoning with today.
Now I think indeed we are certainly struggling a bit more acutely nowadays with this long-standing conversation on localization and decolonization of aid, but also with our disciplines, with the fact that modern humanitarianism, as much as most of our own disciplines, happened to be born in the second part of the 19th century in Western Europe at the time of the expansion of the colonial project. So it's a vast conversation, which is extremely interesting. But I think what you mentioned, Pascal, is important, is this question of power, because of course, if people would not be deprived of their agency and if people would have solvent demand, there is no need for any humanitarian actor to provide any humanitarian assistance or protection. So at the very core of why then there is a sense of a need for intervention in terms of prevention, protection, and assistance is precisely because of powerlessness. And the power imbalance is embedded within the humanitarian project as such. And then the whole question is, how do you deal and address this in a way which is, integrating the care aspect, the responsibility and accountability aspect, the voice of those who are directly affected, which, has to be actually, their voice should be what dictates things, but so we have the discussion, for instance, of the shift to cash assistance and a lot of resistance within the aid system to say, send cash, they will buy cigarettes and alcohol. And well, I think we are overcoming a lot of these conversations, but still it remains at the core of the conversation. I think to discuss this within a project that looks at humanitarian design is really interesting. And the other thing which I think is quite promising, and that's why I'm glad to participate and to see this project and Jonathan coming to fruition, is that there is really this need of humanitarians being so busy with their daily activities, having the chance to connect with critical thinking, with taking some distance and having a fresh look and a diverse look, challenging assumptions and a prioris and revisiting this. And at the same time, I think it can also be interesting to infuse some of the real life, relatively pressing issues within the context of an ongoing research project. So I'm very much looking forward to the continuation of these exchanges.
Thank you, Gilles. So are we?
Just one thing.
Yes.
When Gilles says that we must listen to the people that are receiving the humanitarian aid, it would be good to also call people from the humanitarian hosting right beside here to be in this sort of meeting, to participate more in this sort of meeting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I look at Camilla, who's kindly helped us coordinate, but I actually think we sent out an invitation. And our ambition is actually to give people an active role, because of course sending people an invitation precisely because they're so busy usually means they don't turn up. But yes, thank you. Javier?
Yeah, maybe I can add something about things that have been discussed before about the ambiguity between definitions and also design. I would like to elaborate a bit. So without delving into the kind of precise ontological complexities of how to define kind of design and the plurality of definitions of things, but I think that there are very basic things we all can agree on, which is like design traditionally tends to address programmatic kind of challenges and functions and programs. So there is always a need when design is kind of concerned. So it's a problem, and it's kind of driven. It's the way to find a solution to a very precise kind of problem that drives design kind of traditionally and contemporaneity in terms of the discipline. Then how to address problems creates a kind of seriality as a design process. So design is always kind of procedural. There is a before and after, and there is a seriality so that we see whether it's product design or graphic design or kind of humanitarian design, or no matter what kind of design, there is always a beginning and an idea of a destination. So there is a goal actually that drives the process. And then this sets design kind of apart from other disciplines, such as the arts, for example, in which there's quite often there is no the idea of a final destination. At least design has kind of this idea. Then when it comes to the plurality of the definitions, I think that if we think in terms of text, and if our thinking is kind of text-based, like definitions might vary from different categories to another. But then if we resort quite often like to the images of kind of how different words are converted into images in kind of public imaginaries, or also like in search engines, or nowadays with artificial intelligence. As I was saying in the beginning, like since the very beginning of humanitarian design, like the image and the typology of refugee camps and concentration camps are very much kind of linked to each other. So they look quite similar, and typologically in terms of urban planning, they're quite similar. Whether we like it or not, that's a different issue. But in terms of space design, they are actually quite similar. We know, thanks to Foucault, actually, that the architecture of prisons and the architecture of schools and the architecture of hospitals, in terms of architectural typology, they are quite similar in many ways. Of course, there are specificities. So I think that for design, the fact that different programs and different challenges being addressed with so similar kind of solutions and with so similar kind of images and imaginaries is questionable. It's quite questionable. So I think that actually the project won't try to underline these kind of proximities, but really try to challenge them. So that's why the kind of complexities and the way of addressing how refugees are obviously quite different from prisoners, but how also like their space design should be kind of different and kind of specialized, is also something that the project should try to address, as opposed to a kind of perennial idea of design that tries to replicate similar solutions and just change kind of the label at the entrance of the building, which is how a lot of space design and architectural design has been done up until now, actually.
Thanks, Javier.
Yeah, I can just share with you two things we're experimenting at the museum. And do you see a museum as a lab? It's always a lab. And we're always testing things. And right now we're experiencing the impact of design, and I was fascinated to hear your insight on prison architecture and how to influence the different moments of the day and all of that. Because right now we're showing to our visitors what things can be and how they can feel if we have a user-centered design approach, and if we at the same time give opportunities to, for example, 300 students we've been working with now for 3 years who work at EPFL, who study at EPFL, and we just approached them saying, you know what, the design of our museum clashes now with the vision of our museum. It was designed to look like a bunker, but now we're saying that we're a welcoming forum, so we have a problem. And we gave them carte blanche to listen to our communities and address the needs they identified through design, by designing these temporary wooden architectures, which are in our gardens, and that's are locally sourced. That's a huge opportunity for research and professional experience for these students. And it's totally fascinating to me because it acknowledges and enables new ways of looking at the space, new ways of seeing and feeling the space. Like suddenly people picnic, they play, they sleep, they chat, they talk, they do all of these things, and it's wonderful. And then I get pushback sometimes from people who tell me, well, you know, why are you putting scaffolding outside? I mean, it's not supposed to be a museum. But then I say, well, you know, what you think a museum should be versus what it can be, that's an interesting conversation. Plus this concept, you know, do no harm. Well, we can, if we apply it to ourselves at the heart of International Geneva, this is what it can look like, because we built a water tank so that we can take care of our garden and relaunch biodiversity. So walking the talk through design is fascinating. And right now we are totally redesigning our ground floor. And suddenly this color, there are plants, there is only recycled materials. And the impact it has even on the team, how we feel in our spaces, the energy it gives us, it's mind-blowing. So please come to the museum and see the impact of design, because it works.
Yeah, go to the museum.
I had to face the commercial ad.
So I want to use that as an excuse again to say something addressing Negar's and Sanchez, but also Gilles' preoccupation with power. And I think it's like one of the really interesting things, I think, and it runs through, this is why I said use this as an excuse, runs through the way Pascal thinks about the museum as a lab that is open for us to participate in, etc. There's something very interesting. So very, very briefly, Catherine Malabou, the idea of the anarchic turn in capitalism and the way in which actually power is less and less concentrated in the conventional big sovereigns, etc., and more distributed in these kinds of processes. And I think, you could talk about the distribution. There are all kinds of ways of formulating these points, of course, but basically, the questions of how coloniality, power, the construction of normality in a prison, etc., play out, I think are much more distributed and much more complex than we used to think they were, and profoundly commercialized. So, and this was the connection to, so Catherine Malabou also interested in the ways that generative technologies, whatever, AI, various kinds, etc., play into this. But I think this is something we're it's really interesting to think about how you can deal with that at a micro-political level and what kinds of agency that leaves room for in the museum, but also in the ICRC. And of course, being able to think about things that aren't settled yet is a huge privilege, right? Like we sit here and we talk uselessly for 2 hours, and or uselessly or not, I don't know. I didn't mean that. I don't think it's useless, but certainly it takes quite a lot of time. So I also want to get back to I really think the conversation that Gilles was in on, but also, the fact that Pascal is sitting here today, that you've all come, thank you so much, everyone actually, for coming to take time out of what are actually very busy agendas to hear this grappling conversation of a project that is actually starting, and we of course hope it will congeal and become maybe not, very unified, but at least very much more comprehensible in terms of how we address issues such as coloniality, sovereignty, power, etc., as they play out through the designs in the different areas that we're looking at. So I wanted to say that, yes. I feel like I should. Do you want to say something, Greg? So we have a partner from EPFL sitting in the audience.
Thank you. So hello, everybody. My name is Greg. I'm working for EPFL, Swiss Institute of Technology in Lausanne, and with a center called Essential Tech, which is a partner for this research project. And I'd like just to say, I like your statement, Jonathan, on technology is a weapon. And so a weapon that can be used also, so that's very interesting. And I'd like to say something about technology, another quotation, which is that technology is neither good nor bad, nor neutral. And I think that's quite important, that the way technology is built is never actually neutral. And that's what I like about this project. It's also for us, from an engineering perspective, it can potentially help us, understand better the narratives behind humanitarian design, but also potentially behind design in general that, shape the design of things. And that's something that in what we do, sometimes doing innovation in very constrained environment like humanitarian settings allows you to actually come up with innovation that are useful also outside this context. So it's called reverse innovation. And actually, I think this kind of project can also help us, maybe deconstruct the narrative behind humanitarian design and then draw conclusion more generally about design in our world, and technology design, for instance, which shapes not only, humanitarian settings, but the whole society. So that's also what I like about it. So very much looking forward to this project. Thank you.